When we say a mystery is unsolved, we're not describing a void. We're describing a threshold problem. In our case files, unsolved usually means the records available today can't discriminate between competing explanations because the discriminating evidence is missing, inaccessible, or too contested to weigh consistently. On one side of the desk, a claim usually leans on proximity. Another claim leans on corroboration. Those are different forms of strength, and they can contradict each other while still sounding confident. A contemporary report might be close in time and place, but it can be biased, incomplete, or based on hearsay. A later historian might sound careful, yet their chain of custody can thin out citing sources they never saw, or translating wording that shifts meaning at the margins. Across major mysteries, we keep finding the same structural pattern. Multiple accounts survive, but the key item that would collapse the options does not. Sometimes that missing item is a document that should exist but doesn't, like a page count that suddenly breaks, or a ledger entry that skips the relevant date. Other times it's material evidence, claimed in one account but never recovered, or recovered in a way that cannot be independently verified. Translation disputes behave similarly. A phrase that can bear two meanings can keep two narratives alive indefinitely. We treat every folder like a grid stamped with source proximity and corroboration level. The point isn't to crown winners. It's to map where the uncertainty actually lives. If two explanations both fit the surviving facts, then the case isn't unknown, it's underconstrained. And when underconstraints persist, the investigation turns toward a specific question. What single missing item would force one interpretation to fail? That's the mindset we bring forward next, reading the gaps themselves as evidence and using them to identify the most discriminating questions to pursue. 2. We open the Voynich manuscript the way we open a sealed safe in an evidence room, hand steady. Senses tuned to what the objects will and 1 tell us. The pages themselves feel smooth, the ink dark against parchment, and the handwriting looks deceptively uniform, like a system that could be audited. But when we chase authentication, we learn that a dated material baseline is not the same thing as a decoded meaning. Carbon dating and ink or material analyses can narrow a production window, sometimes excluding the earliest or latest proposals. That part is measurable, and it matters because it changes which scribes, libraries, or copying cultures are even plausible. Yet the next step, what the manuscript says, or whether it uses a cipher, is where the records stop tightening. The problem isn't just that language identification is hard. It's that the manuscript's structure and frequency patterns do not uniquely identify a known cipher system. Multiple generative explanations can produce similar texture without collapsing into one. This creates a specific kind of discrepancy. The material studies can move the dial by half a degree, but the interpretive claims keep recentering themselves around different assumptions about how text was encoded or how it was written. If you cannot point to a known cipher key or to a matching corpus with distinctive markers, then any translation that sounds confident remains underdetermined. We can't treat handwriting and vocabulary like guesses as proof when the statistical fingerprints don't lock to a single method. The case stays balanced on a safe dial that turns only a little. Physical dating narrows the when, meaning still 1 click into place, so the investigation turns to the one question that can make the options diverge sharply. Now, let us pivot to Roanoke, but not to the legend first. We start with the documentation timeline, because the Roanoke narrative you think may be a mashup of records written at different distances from the events. The map detail is where the discrepancy begins. One later line of reporting preserves a striking word crotone, as if it sits directly on the shoreline clue. But other versions of the account either omit it entirely or describe a different set of visible markings. If crotone was present and legible, why doesn't every early retelling reproduce it with the same specificity? The absence isn't proof of absence, but it is an anomaly we can measure against the chronology of who copied whom. Here, the story problem that grows out of that map problem. As accounts move forward in time, the narrative tends to reinterpret earlier fragments, sometimes reassigning motive, sometimes aligning the settlement's fate to a destination already implied by later knowledge. Each retelling can sound reasonable on its own, yet when we align layers like a transparency sheet over the same shoreline outline, the story drifts. One layer adds a distinctive clue, another removes it. The drift suggests the details may be accumulating, being selected, or being reframed rather than simply transmitted. So I want to challenge you directly. Are you avoiding the hard question of when was this detail first written down and who had access to which version? Because it's less satisfying than a single, clean disappearance? Before we can assess meaning, we have to track the evidence trail itself, where it begins, where it changes, and what early record holders appear to know. For Jack the Ripper, the common suspect canon doesn't start as a list, it starts as overlapping paperwork. Witness statements, police records, and later retrospective accounts all exist, but they don't occupy the same time on the timeline. That timing gap is where cross-contamination becomes an anomaly with consequences. Picture a photocopier that never stops. The earliest copies give you raw shapes, a fragment of description, a rough chronology, a name written once and then debated. Then, in later printings, someone adds annotations. This likely means this fits, this resembles, and the new marks look official because they're printed in the same typeface as the original. But the added lines are interpretive. They are not contemporaneous evidence. They are commentary that quietly becomes part of the page. Now take one concrete hypothetical moment. Suppose an early investigator writes that a witness noticed a foreign accent or a distinctive manner of speech, and that note sits in the file for decades. A later author, working from a partial set of transcripts, cites a police description that includes the accent claim plus a speculative link to a known printer, a known tavern, or a known grudge. On paper, the later account reads like corroboration. In reality, it may be a selective citation, one that reuses police-style phrasing while shifting the motive, not just the identity. This is how the set of possible perpetrators can shrink or shift in non-obvious ways when we separate contemporaneous descriptions from retrospective theories. When we strip away the later annotations that borrow authority from police documents, the candidate pool changes. The motive attributions change too, sometimes because the retrospective writer needed a coherent narrative, not because the original record supported it. The discrepancy isn't that later accounts lie in obvious ways. It's that they merge streams. They blend what was said, what was written by police, and what was inferred later, until you can no longer tell which lines were copied from evidence and which lines were drawn from expectation. And once that distinction blurs, the next question becomes unavoidable. Not just who might have done it, but which was even allowed to enter the record in the first place. Across 20 mysteries, we keep running into the same mirage. The record looks consistent until we sort its distance. One account sounds closer because it uses specific wording, a date, or a named location. Another sounds earlier because it's quoted by later writers. Both can be wrong, and that is the discrepancy that resolves only after we run the file through the same 3-round filter. Imagine a bracket that doesn't rank by drama, but by recoverable provenance. In the first tier, source proximity decides who gets a seat at the table. Contemporaneous notes, sworn statements, dated correspondence, and material traces beat retrospective summaries that recycle police-style language. In the second tier, we test contradictions survived, meaning the claim that remains after translation cleaning, transcription repair, and wording normalization. A foreign accent may survive as accent, but if the underlying language shifts from one testimony transcript set to another, the survival is contested, not confirmed. Then the third tier is the only one that actually narrows hypotheses. Next decisive test. For each mystery, we ask one calibrated question. What single new observation would discriminate between the top 2 or 3 explanations without requiring us to choose motives by literary plausibility? The most informative questions are always the ones that force separation. So, for any mystery, we begin by mapping each claim into source close versus source far. Then we compare the contradictions that persist after we remove obvious friction, mistranslations, synonym drift, and later editorial framing. If a contradiction disappears only when we accept a later author's interpretation, that resolution is simply an artifact of citation, not a resolution of events. This is where the apparent contradiction becomes actionable. The record may never directly name the culprit in a way we can fully verify, but it often contains a hinge, a missing page, a chronological break, an ambiguous phrase that multiple hypotheses would treat differently, or a detail whose presence depends on which transcript set was consulted. 2. When we're done with this bracket, we 1T just know what people claimed. We'll know what kind of evidence would have to win round by round before the next explanation earns entry into the file. And that determines how we move through the remaining cases, not by accumulating facts, but by designing the order in which we test them. You came in thinking these ultimate mysteries are either supernatural or untestable because the evidence is always too messy to compare. But the case file method changes the job. We don't chase drama, we separate source close from source far, strip friction like transcription drift and editorial framing, and treat unsolved as a category with a checklist. Locate contradictions, map gaps, find the hinge detail, then state the single observation that would discriminate between rival explanations. If you want better answers, use this lens on your next mystery. Send your pics and your evidence, and we'll pressure test them together. Point 2.